Welcome everyone. My name is Sandra Steingraber, and we are part of a really historic evening tonight, I think. Our conversation here tonight marks a turning point for New York's anti-fracking movement, because no longer are we only concerning ourselves with the outcome of fracturing the shale underneath our feet and trying to protect our own communities, but we're now taking a look at the entire infrastructure of the natural gas industry, and we are turning our attention to the health and safety issues that it poses to us, the threats that these infrastructure projects pose to our climate, and what it also does to other people, not just in our own communities, but the place where they, even if we don't frack in New York, the place where the gas may be fracked. I think it's right and correct that we are hosting this evening in a church, because we're going to be raising a lot of different moral and ethical issues tonight as we take up the question of liquefied natural gas. So I want to begin with a personal thanks. I'm sure I owe half the people, if not more, in this room tonight, personal thank you for all the support that you provided my husband and me following Jeff's 2 strokes this summer. The outpouring from the community has been incredible, and it has allowed me to be here tonight and to carry on and to keep fighting. I felt that when this kind of outpouring of meals and gift certificates and fundraisers started coming in, that's what the community wanted me to do, is to be able to continue this work. And so I am. My recommitment to the collective work that we're doing comes with a new resolve for me, which is stroke patients are very sensitive to air pollution, and we know that the kind of air pollution that fracking creates and infrastructure projects create is linked to stroke risk. So I have yet another reason, if I didn't need one, to fight with all of my heart against this industry. And so we can't be tired. We can't be sick of it. We can't be afraid. We have to soldier on and find new reasons to keep fighting. And that's, I think, what the impulse that brings us together. So here's an overview of our situation. We've, for at least temporarily, have really barred the door on fracking in New York, and we should feel amazed at ourselves for having done that. It's a real story of the power of the public and the citizenry to take away the social license for a very harmful industry to operate and turn our land into its factory floor. So we really did that, and we should be amazed at ourselves for doing that. But even as we sort of celebrate our newfound power, we need to recognize that the industry now is changing strategy. And so we're being fracked through the back door, so to speak. And so we see around us now in the infrastructure for natural gas, it's liquefaction, it's possible export, and so on, with compressor stations and pipeline stations, and talk about turning over coal-burning power plants into natural gas power plants, and talk about repurposing salt caverns for the temporary storage of fracked gases and so forth. And so suddenly it's no longer just the Josh Fox image of the flaming faucet, right, that united us all, but rather it has dispersed into a lot of different imagery and a lot of different projects that we're now going to have to become very conversant with and very fluent with, and become the critics of and find a language for and forcefully make our case. And so the task before us is even perhaps more difficult to sort of master than the simplicity of fracking itself. And so we can celebrate our power as people. At the same time, we realize that there are ominous clouds on our horizon, and that really it's us who are going to have to find the language to do that. And so we're here for a simple reason, which is to learn how to comment, to learn the substance of what to say when you turn a pen into, or a computer screen, into a powerful weapon. So we're going to find our voices and speak truth to power by educating ourselves about this new threat. And so by the end of the evening, I think you'll all have plenty of comments to say. I don't have any doubt about that. But I want to make one other ask of you, and it's from the bottom of my heart, which is to say that the most powerful comment that you could make in the next week is with your own body, by showing up in Albany on October 30th at the one public hearing that we've been afforded. Remember, with the fracking regs and the yes guys, we were given a chance to have many to speak and submit comments on many different occasions, but now we have just this one opportunity in Albany. Next Wednesday, a week from today, October 30th, I'm asking you all to get on the bus with me and go to Albany and drop everything that you could possibly do. There's nothing more important than you could do next Wednesday than to be in Albany. Not only, by then you will have written your 30 comments, right? Obviously you'll be an expert on the issue, but to be able to stand there in front of the microphone, in front of the DEC, in front of the newspapers and the television cameras that will be recording you, and to speak for 2 minutes and register your objections to liquefied natural gas moving forward, to lift a 40-year moratorium and replace it with a really sloppy and vague set of regulations. That's what I'm asking all of us in the community to do on Wednesday. Drop everything you can and come. And John Armstrong, my colleague at New York Museum's Fracking, is going to circulate around sign-up sheets so you can write your commitment to that right tonight. So they're actually making a decision about whether to run a bus from Ithaca based on the kind of excitement and enthusiasm and vibe we can actually get this evening. So you hold a lot of cards on that. All right, so with that, I want to introduce our speaker for tonight, and then I'll come back at the very end and tell you a little bit about my resurrected 30 Days of Fracking project. But the real substance of the evening belongs to my esteemed friend and colleague, Keith Schue, who comes to us all the way from Cherry Valley, New York. He's a transplant from Florida, so like me, he is a New Yorker, not by birth, but by what Quakers would call convincement. And he brings with him 5 years of work with the Nature Conservancy. He has focused on government relations and has boundless experience serving the government as a member of both federal, state, and also local advisory boards. And in that work, he focuses on natural resources. So what better person to understand the relationships between how government makes policy and how our natural resources need to be protected. But if that weren't enough, he also has graduate and postgraduate work in engineering. So he understands the engineering of liquefied natural gas, and he is eloquent, and so is going to be able to break it all down for us. I dare say that Keith, like me, is a kind of mild-mannered person. We didn't necessarily imagine ourselves at the barricades, fighting kind of against our own shy temperaments, perhaps, but here we are doing the best we can, and sometimes I think the mild-mannered people have the strongest and boldest message. So with that, over to you, dear Keith.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Sandra. I'll try to live up to the kind words that were said just now. Don't know if I have the screen here. You had a screen. I'm probably going to have to reboot my computer. You really went to sleep, didn't you? Yeah, my computer went to sleep here. No, here we go. Almost there. I'm going to set myself up over here. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for having me here. I also want to thank all of you because Ithaca, this area, Sandra, the expertise, the leadership that has come from this community has made all the difference to take us to where we are right now in terms of making sure that fracking does not happen within our state. I am going to be talking about a different type of in-frack-structure, you could say. Let me tell you a little bit about myself first. I went to the University of Virginia School of Engineering and Applied Science. I worked as an engineer, electrical engineer, for about 14 years. Most of that time was in Florida. Living in Florida, I saw a lot of what was happening around me in terms of development and so forth. It was disturbing. A lot of impacts to the environment. It's something that troubled me. I became more involved in environmental advocacy type of work. And one day I realized that I was caring more about that than my engineering job. So I left my engineering job, did environmental advocacy, volunteer work for a while, and then I took a job at the Nature Conservancy where I had the opportunity to work on issues that involved government interaction and policy. I have had the opportunity to look at regulations, rules, legislation, proposed legislation. I've drafted some of those things, and it's a learning experience, I'll tell you that. I also had the opportunity to sit on a local county government advisory board for 6 years in the county where I live. And so I had an opportunity to look at how rules work, how regulations work, and what kind of content you have to have with the words that are on paper for them to have some kind of meaning. Now I live in New York State, been here about 3 years, and I love it here. I'll be the first one to tell you that I'm not an expert on LNG. If you ask me some deeply technical question, I probably won't know the answer. But I'm learning, as is everybody else here. And what I think I do bring to the table, like I said, wearing different hats in the past, I've looked at legislation, policies, codes, and regulations. And like I said, I think I have a pretty good handle on what kind of content you need to see in the words that you put on paper. So I think that's what I bring to the table here. Fracking, that's what we have all, that's what has been our big concern. And we know that there's, we're still waiting on the result from the S-guys, from DEC, and the health review from Dr. Shaw. I'm not sure what's in it, but we're waiting on it. And until that time, we're not being fracked. Or are we? If you ask a lot of people, they're already being fracked, particularly the folks who live on the border near Pennsylvania. They're already being fracked by infrastructure. So, whether it is the pipelines, whether it is the truck traffic, whether it is the compressor stations, man camps across the street in Pennsylvania, we're being impacted by natural gas infrastructure, or in-frack-structure, I should say. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about one particular type of infrastructure, and that is liquefied natural gas. So, and it manifests itself in many different ways. And it could manifest itself in different ways here in New York, depending on how this all plays out. We'll get to that in a minute, in a few minutes. First of all, a little bit of LNG 101. What is liquefied natural gas? How does it work? Well, first of all, it's a storage mechanism. You don't actually burn liquid gas. You store it in liquid form, and you move it around to different places and convert it back to gas, and that's when you use it. But think about what's involved in the process. You retrieve the gas, you have to compress it, turn it into a liquid, put it on trucks, put it on ships, ship it around the world, take it to its destination, regasify it, and then do something with it. There's energy lost in that process. There's inefficiencies in just that alone. About 30% is what we're hearing is the inefficiencies of just going through the process of gas to liquid to gas again. LNG occupies about 1/600th of the volume of methane in gaseous form. And the way it works is through a cryogenic process. That means we're doing things at low temperature. You might, minus 259 degrees Fahrenheit. You might recall from high school chemistry or college thermodynamics that the volume of a gas is indirectly proportional to pressure. It's directly proportional to temperature. So that means you can get a volume of gas to take up less space, to be smaller, if you put a lot of pressure from the outside on it, or you lower the temperature. And that's what happens with liquefied natural gas. It's brought to very low temperatures, minus 259 degrees Fahrenheit, and then so the volume reduces. If you keep doing that, it changes from a gas to liquid. So how do you keep something like that cold? Well, basically, you have to put it in canisters that are like thermos bottles, but they're very, very large. They're designed to keep the heat out. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But the size of these thermos bottles, they come in all different shapes and sizes, and depending on what exactly is how this gas is being used and where it's going. I want to show you this picture here because, to me, when I saw this, I was thinking, this looks like a coliseum. This is a LNG tank being constructed. It's literally the size of a coliseum too. These are big structures that are being built. This is one from Tokyo, Japan, 250,000 cubic meters. I'm not talking gallons, cubic meters. There's about 260, I think, gallons in a cubic meter. Anyway, this one can hold a 20-story building vertically. It can hold a 20-story building horizontally. It's a tremendous amount of volume. If you translate to that, multiplied by 600, the amount of gas that this equates to, it's massive. And when you put them on boats, it's not just rolling a canister up on the deck of a ship. These ships are specifically designed from their internal hull structure to be LNG tankers. That's what they're for. There are about 300 of them around the world right now carrying liquefied natural gas. And there, as we speak, there are about, I think, 50 to 80 being built. So it's a formidable issue we're talking about here. This is where the LNG tanks dock, major industrial operations. This one here is Tokyo Bay, Japan. So when a tanker pulls in liquefied natural gas is taken off the ship, where does it go? Well, sometimes it goes to a power plant. Sometimes it goes into a pipeline. Other times it goes into smaller vessels, smaller canisters of liquefied natural gas that are carted around for various purposes. The thing that the state of New York would like to do, apparently DC would like to do these days, is promote the use of liquefied natural gas LNG trucks that would run on LNG. So that's what you're looking at here. Basically, this is carrying the big tanks that then get placed here. The truck fueling station, and the truck itself, this is carrying something else. So the truck is running on LNG, so that's the canister that's under the cab. This is what it looks like. Again, it kind of looks like a thermos bottle because that is what it is. But you can't just fill it up like you would at a regular gasoline station. You have to wear protective gloves and masks to prevent injury from the super cool liquid methane. You remember in maybe high school when your science teacher had liquid nitrogen and you dumped something in it like a rose or something like that, and smash it on the table and it shatters like glass. That's what would happen to you if you come into contact with this stuff. So it's a hazardous material to work with at very cold temperatures. Okay, how is that heat? How is the heat kept out? Okay, it's insulated tanks, but heat still comes in from the outside. How do you maintain refrigeration? There's a particular process. They call it auto-refrigeration. What it means is that methane is periodically vented. It's boiled off, if you will, from the LNG tanks. It has the effect of cooling what remains in the tank. And the reason that works is because that evaporation process is a cooling activity. It's kind of like when you sweat. When you sweat, liquid comes out of your body, it evaporates and it cools you down. That's the same principle that's at work here. Methane is allowed to vent off, and it cancels out the heat. The heat that's taken out of the system, it cancels out the heat that would be coming in from the outside. That's how it works. But this means that methane emission is a routine aspect of LNG storage. So just the tanks sitting there, they're polluting the environment. Keep that in mind. Emissions also occur during regasification. This is a picture of an LNG regasification plant where LNG has been stored and now it's going to be put back into gaseous form and used. You see a flare stack. We're used to seeing, or we know about flare stacks that happen at gas wells, and we also know that there's this requirement for green completion. This is supposed to be a requirement coming along before too long, which says that you have to hook to a pipeline for a gas well. Well, these flare stacks, they're always going to be there at these regasification plants. So this is an issue. This is something that we don't usually think of relating to these facilities, but sure enough, there they are. And you may know that just a few weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was an awful thing that happened up at the Canaport LNG plant in New Brunswick, Canada. In one evening alone, 7,500 birds died by being attracted to the flare stack, getting burned up or asphyxiated and falling to the ground. It actually, if you read the articles on that, you'll learn that the workers, the people who worked at the plant, were brought to tears. It was so sad what took place. Explosion and fire, let's talk about that a little bit. What happens when LNG escapes? Well, the industry will tell you that it's not really a problem because LNG is not flammable, it's a liquid, right? Technically that's true, but it doesn't stay a liquid for very long. It occupies 1/600th the volume of methane gas, so when it's released, it immediately starts to boil off, and it assumes its original form. It expands, and it starts to drift as a vapor cloud in the direction of prevailing winds. So let's hope that those winds don't take the vapor cloud over your village or your town or your city, because then if you light a match, you have a pretty significant problem. When the gas reaches a diffusion of about 5 to 15%, mixing with the air that's around it, that's when it becomes ignitable. And if that wind takes the vapor cloud into a populated area, like I said, it could be catastrophic. What you're looking at here is a picture of a study that was done for the operation of a proposed LNG terminal in Astoria, I think, in Oregon. And basically you're seeing the channel that the vessel would be using. The study looked at what would happen if there was an accident on board and LNG escaped, and the vapor cloud that might extend from that. The projection was it could be 1.5 miles, and that impacts the neighboring community. There's a group called the Columbia Riverkeeper, and they are working very hard to fight this. And they have written that the consequences of an accidental or terrorist-induced ignition of a vapor cloud from an LNG tanker could be catastrophic. They're absolutely right. And from their analysis, it's not just 1.5 miles, it could be much further than that. What you're looking at here is an evaluation that was done at another terminal that was proposed back in 1977 in the city of Oxnard. I believe that's in California. And the analysis there showed that the vapor cloud could reach 30 miles before it ignites, and potentially putting 70,000 people at risk. Fortunately, the powers that be in this community said no. Unfortunately, you're not getting that kind of leadership in other places where LNG terminals are being proposed. It's time that we educate our elected officials about what the risks actually are. So let's talk a little bit about these rights that are being proposed for LNG here in New York State. Right now, unlike other states, LNG facilities can't be built here in our state. And there's an interesting historical reason for that, a very good reason for that, and it goes back to a horrific event that happened on Staten Island on February 10th, 1973. 40 workers were cleaning inside of an LNG tank at a facility in Staten Island. What occurred was that there was some type of remaining gas, perhaps caught between parts of the tank structure, and there was an explosion. The explosion caused the top of that tank, the concrete tank, to lift 10 feet up in the air and come crashing down on the 40 people inside, killing all of them. It made a lot of press. Needless to say, 40 workers died. And another thing that's important to recognize for this here is that there was opposition to this plant. There were people who lived nearby who knew this was not being done safely, who knew it was dangerous. They tried to stop it. Ironically, blast was their name. Remedial action stopped the tanks. Well, it took a real blast. It took a tragedy for anything to change. Well, what did change? It led to a statewide legislative ban, I guess I should say moratorium, on LNG that lasted about 20 years. And actually, that moratorium is still in place in New York City until 2015, which is just around the corner. In 1976, the New York State Legislature said, okay, if we're ever going to allow LNG here in New York State again, we need to have some rules to make sure that we don't have the same type of incidents that's happening, so that people don't die, that it's done safely. And so they passed a statute, Environmental Conservation Law, Article 23, Title 17, to require the promulgation of LNG rules. Well, DEC didn't do anything. 40 years later, now we're talking about DEC bringing forward rules. But the good news about this is that we have enjoyed a de facto ban on LNG for the last 40 years while nothing took place. So you would think that with this incident in the backdrop, this historical context that we now have for LNG in New York State, you'd think that given that tragic history, that this time, if DEC proposes rules to permit LNG, they would have to be the strongest, most comprehensive regulations possible. That's what you'd think, right? Well, think again. You'd think that considering that the Staten Island tragedy might have been prevented if only the powers that be had listened to the public who had warned them about the safety problems at that site, and had warned them about the dangers that were present. You think that given that history of having ignored the public once before, that this time DEC would be going to the greatest lengths possible to engage the public with multiple hearings around the state. That's what it took. Get input from people of every discipline. That's what you'd think, right? Well, that's not happening either. The sad fact is that it took DEC nearly 40 years to put these rules together, if you want to call them that. They've given us about 40 days to review them. So, I can't think of anything more disrespectful of the people who lost their lives 40 years ago, and of the people who tried to stop that tragedy from happening than what's occurring right now. And at least I didn't think I could find anything worse until I actually opened up the rules themselves and saw what was inside. And I found that there's basically nothing there. So let's talk about what the rules actually say. I've identified several issues here, and I'll just try to go through them for you. Ambiguity of scope. If you talk to DEC, call them on the phone. If you look at what they've said in press releases, you'll see a lot of talk about truck refueling stations. So you might think, okay, that's the small potato stuff. Maybe we can live with that. Well, what do the proposed rules actually say? Do they limit it to truck refueling stations? Do they say anything about the size of how big these LNG facilities could be? No, they don't. If you look at the regulatory impact statement that's coupled with these regulations, you find out what's really going on. And you learn that there's a whole lot of different things that could be approved, that could eventually be built here in New York State if these rules are promulgated. LNG import-export terminals. Now, granted, that would also require federal approval. Peak shaving plants that produce, store, and vaporize LNG. Regional LNG production facilities, and the word relatively large quantities, that's not my wording, that's actually in the regulatory impact statement, relatively large quantities. Production at natural gas wells, it's fracking, right? LNG production facilities with access to natural gas pipelines. And of course, they do mention the one thing that they like to talk about, which is the truck refueling stations. Anyways, I'll tell you also, the regulatory impact statement even refers to a company right now that's interested in building a liquefaction, that's a production facility for LNG in the southern tier. And if you look closely at the rules, there's even a reference to the transfer of LNG to marine vessels. So we're not talking about just truck stops. Now, the regulatory that statement goes on to say, well, don't worry, there's, probably only about 21 facilities would be permitted in the first 5 years. First of all, okay, say most of them are. What about the few that aren't? What about the other big whoppers that we don't know about? But beyond that, what about after 5 years? These rules apply indefinitely, right? So I plan to be around for a lot more than 5 years. And I care about the future of our children that we're leaving this planet too, as well. So telling me what's going to happen in 5 years doesn't really mean a whole lot. DEC needs to be forthright about what the type of facilities that could be permitted are now and in the future under these proposed rules. I go further and say that if this is about truck refueling stations, then go ahead and prohibit the other things. Make that part of the rule too. I want to say something else here about the definition, and this goes to something that happened at our meeting that took place in Syracuse. The first public meeting took place in Syracuse about a week ago, and it was kind of a twilight. To me, it was a Twilight Zone moment because DEC basically started to say, well, these rules don't necessarily apply to production plants, because if you look closely at the definition says storing liquefied natural gas, and it talks about converting liquefied natural gas to natural gas. So don't worry, these rules don't apply to production. Well, we pressed them further for what that meant, and it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be production plants. It just means they're not going to regulate them. So, even if you accept this interpretation, even if DEC is going to say, okay, we're not going to regulate production, and why would that be anyway? I mean, it doesn't make sense if you're regulating storage or you're regulating regasification. Wouldn't you want to regulate production too? That's actually a more intensive type of operation. So that doesn't add up at face value. But aside from that, what happens with these rules has everything to do with production. And the reason for that is that right now, we know that, according to the enabling legislation, that storage of LNG would come underneath the jurisdiction of DEC. And the vast majority, I think of all production facilities have storage on site. So, if these rules don't get passed, then you won't have storage, and if you don't have storage on site, you're not going to have these massive industrial production facilities either. Conversely, if these rules are passed, and you see storage facilities happening, and if DEC is not even regulating the production end of it, well, that means those large industrial production operations will occur as well. So don't let DEC tell you that this doesn't relate to production, because it does relate to production. Lack of siting criteria. When you look at the enabling legislation, that 1976 statute, it mentions various specific things that need to be content requirements of the rules that are being promulgated. It talks about residential areas, population densities, it talks about vapor clouds. So what do the proposed rules say about siting? What does it say about those things I just mentioned? Well, almost nothing. You don't see any specific siting requirements in the rules for distances from schools or residences or hospitals, places of assembly, things that we expect to see, things that we would care about. Instead, DEC is deferring to these National Fire Protection Association codes. And I want to talk a little bit more about that because it's important to understand what the NFPA codes are. First of all, they're codes that are written by industry. They're copyrighted, they're relatively hard to access. You can get to them online if you get the right software on your computer, which I eventually did. And you can look at the pages one at a time, you can't print them out. So these are rules of this, these will become rules of the state. It won't be that hard for the public to read. It won't be that easy for the public to read. And they involve some things that, they involve statistical analysis to look at risk. This doesn't translate very well into a regulatory context. It's not a substitute for regulations. What you don't see are things that are measurable, enforceable thresholds, like distances, buffers that would be needed for different storage LNG facilities of different sizes. This is what you would expect to see in a rule. This is what a regulator would be looking at to see if compliance is happening. And without those measurable thresholds, it's difficult for DEC to effectively gauge compliance, and it's impossible for the public to know what kind of protections they would be getting. So let's drill a little bit deeper, whereas a fracker would say get into the Utica, and talk about what these risk assessments do, how risk assessment works with the NFPAs. This is a picture from the NFPA codes, and what you're seeing here is a tolerable risk chart. It's called the FN domain, frequency of fatalities versus the number of fatalities, the number of people who would be affected. And so there's this tolerable risk here. And you can achieve a tolerable risk, according to the industry standards, if you expose a lot of people to a low risk, okay? But you can also achieve that tolerable area if you expose fewer people to much higher risk. Well, if you live in a rural area, that's kind of disturbing, isn't it? Because what this means is that an LNG facility, doing the statistics, doing the numbers, it doesn't have to be as safe in a rural area because not as many people would die. Okay, that bothers me. I think it bothers anybody who lives in a rural area, because that end could be you. that number could be you. You know, this disparate treatment of human beings is unacceptable. Another aspect of this that we need to recognize is that the rules do require that the applicant submit information on land use and zoning. But a lot of communities don't have zoning rules, in rural areas especially. And so this kind of sets those folks up for a situation where an argument can be made pretty effectively that you can have very little risk or no risk if you put these LNG plants in a rural area where nobody lives right now. Okay? Nobody can die because nobody's right there. Well, what if you're that neighboring property owner? Maybe you don't live there, but you own the land. What if you have other plants in that land? Maybe you want to put a house on yourself. Maybe you want to put several houses there. Maybe you want to build a subdivision. I don't know. But the point is that your property rights are being deprived. And you end up your land ends up becoming a buffer for the facility that came in there first. Arguably, this is a taking of adjacent private property as a de facto buffer for the facility. And the application section of the rule also requires that information be provided on land use and population, like I said, but that's only within a half mile. Depending on the size of the facility, you know, the explosion or vapor cloud impacts could extend beyond that, so that's not adequate. What I would say is if these rules are adopted, a lot of work needs to be done. There needs to be meaningful siting criteria for the location of facilities to protect people, communities, and the environment. There needs to be some substantial buffers spelled out, berms, other protective measures that would be there regardless of where they are located, regardless if they're in a rural area. The safety requirements should be just as strong in rural areas as in more populated urban areas. Isn't that fair? Because the proposed rules lack the type of meaningful siting content that we're talking about here, an argument can be made that they fail to satisfy the legislative intent of the enabling statute. Well, what else happened in New York City beside that tragic accident in Staten Island in 1973? We all of us know that 3,000 people died on the September 11th tragedy. And you'd think that maybe that would be a consideration when it comes to these rules. Do you think that the word terrorism, maybe some analysis of terrorism risk required in these rules? There's not a word about that here. Despite the fact that we know the risk is real. In 2008, a congressional report titled Liquefied Natural Gas Infrastructure Security stated that LNG infrastructure is inherently hazardous and potentially attractive to terrorists. They also acknowledged that local officials and community groups have challenged LNG infrastructure proposals on the grounds that they present an unacceptable risk to the public. Interestingly, this 2008 report also did say that, although this is true, there has not been an attack yet. Well, I want to tell you about something that happened not too long ago. This year, there was an attack. So we can't say there hasn't been an attack at an LNG facility anymore. Al-Qaeda, there was an attack in Yemen. Fortunately, it did not succeed. But this is a serious risk, and we have to be taking it seriously. We live in a very different world than in 1976 when the legislature asked DEC to promulgate these rules. We talk about size criteria. Well, we know that despite what DEC is saying, the proposed rules are not limited to truck refueling stations. And size matters because the damage from explosions and inaudible vapor clouds can extend miles, and it's directly related to how big they are, how big the storage capacity is. In addition to the danger of catastrophe, explosions or fire, the function and size of the facility affects the magnitude of other impacts, like noise, traffic, and emissions. These are all dependent on how big the facilities are too. But the rules don't say anything to limit size. Because the proposed rules lack any substantive size or location criteria, they would potentially allow LNG facilities of any size, of any type, to be built virtually anywhere in New York. I would say that if these rules are promulgated, the size of the facility should be limited. And I shouldn't say 100,000, I think 40,000 is the proper target. But and minimum requirements should be included for buffers, berms, and other protective measures as a function of storage capacity. DEC has publicly stated that the purpose of this whole exercise is to facilitate truck refueling stations. That's what they're saying today. If that's true, then the rules that are promulgated should expressly prohibit other LNG facilities. And I want to make sure I'm clear when I say prohibit. It's not adequate for DEC to say, okay, these rules just don't apply to production facilities. They just don't apply to bigger stuff, and those things could still happen on their own without regulations. That's actually worse. That's not what's acceptable. They need to actually prohibit the other facilities that we're talking about here and limit it to the small stuff that we're talking about, small stuff. Inadequate control on emissions. We all know methane is a greenhouse gas, and it's even more potent than carbon dioxide, at least for the first 20 years or so after it is released into the atmosphere. In addition to fugitive emissions, which are chronic in any type of natural gas facility, methane is intentionally emitted from storage tanks as part of auto refrigeration, like I said before. And it also occurs in the gasification plants where flaring takes place. Well, the proposed rules ignore this problem. It basically says nothing about the intentional emissions of methane, and there are no measures required to do anything about that. If these rules are promulgated, there should be some specific requirements included to restrict the release of unburned methane and to limit flaring. There should be requirements for the recapture of methane vented from LNG tanks or as part of regasification or lost during refueling. And there's also another specific thing I just want to point to. I find it just outrageous, but there's a requirement here for the closure of LNG tanks, and it says that the above ground, I'm not sure why it doesn't mention below ground, but it says above ground storage tanks designated as permanently closed must be vented to the atmosphere. It actually says you can't recapture it, you have to vent it to the atmosphere. Let's change that. Let's talk about natural resource protection. These rules contain no substantive requirements pertaining to natural resources, including land, water, air, and wildlife. They're fire protection codes. That's all they are. This is what it says in the application section of the rules. A description of the possible environmental impacts of the proposed facility and facility features and procedures to mitigate those impacts. There has to be a description of possible environmental impacts. Well, what does that mean? It's vague. Basically, this lets the applicant decide what environmental factors need to be evaluated and what measures, if any, need to be implemented to address them. There's no mention of specific studies that need to occur. environmental features to serve any wetlands, floodplain, species, or habitat. None of this is in there. There's no mention of even things that would affect the integrity of the facility, like false soils and slopes. There's no mention of information that must be provided relating to that. There's no mention of pre-development assessment or post-development analysis of monitoring of natural resources that could be negatively impacted. Air, water quality, noise and light, wildlife populations, public conservation lands that are nearby. There's no evaluation of these things required at all in these rules. There's no mention of cumulative impacts. And there's no specific requirements to avoid impacts or even minimum standards for mitigation. So there's a lot to be done for these rules to become acceptable. Without any specific requirements for information that must be provided by the applicant, there's no way for DEC to say that you have a sufficient application, is there? And there's also no way for the regulators to determine if compliance is achieved when you're not telling them what they must do. Anyways, this makes it impossible for DEC to determine whether acceptable levels of impact have been exceeded, and so DEC can't really honestly fulfill its statutory obligation of protecting the environment and the people of our state. So I want to talk about requirements for monitoring, reporting, and records. You think this would be very important for us to protect the facility, right? Well, there's only one type of incident that's mentioned in the rules at all that have to be reported, and those are LNG spills. There's no other requirement for reporting, maintaining records on other accidents. What about the release of methane and gases? Other chemical spills or fires and explosions that didn't come from an LNG spill, or human injury? None of this is mentioned in there. What about wildlife impacts? What about like what occurred at that plant in Canada? Well, according to these rules, you don't even have to tell anybody that it happened. What about requirements for maintaining records on the release of greenhouse gases, equipment leaks, intentional venting? All this relates to air quality and climate change. And what about requirements for equipment and components to be monitored, to be inspected, to be replaced? All this is important. All this is essential for an industrial facility that involves complex operations, cryogenic storage, materials handled at extreme temperatures and pressures, where emissions are an issue and safety is an ongoing concern. Inspections need to happen, and records of that information need to be provided to DEC so that DEC knows that facilities are operating up to par. I want to go back to the LNG spills for a moment here. If you look carefully at what the rules actually say about reporting LNG spills, you will find that that's not even clear. It says that LNG spills only have to be reported if they result in, or this is the fuzzy wording, or may reasonably be expected to result in fire with a potential off-site impact, or potentially could cause explosion. Well, what does that mean? Who gets to decide those things? It means the applicant, because it doesn't say otherwise. It doesn't say anything about the volume of spillage that could happen before the applicant will do anything. And so the applicant, or the operator, the LNG operator, gets to decide what kind of spills need to be reported, or if they want to report them. And the rules let an operator wait 2 hours before doing anything, before they have to pick up the phone to even tell DEC that something happened. And that's even if neighboring people or property could be impacted. If you look at what it says there, it's wide open. This encourages carelessness and allows accidents to continue. And an example I will give is, say you are with DEC and you get a call on the phone by a neighboring resident next to one of these LNG facilities because there's a vapor cloud and it's coming their way, and this person is concerned. And so DEC contacts the LNG operator and says, well, we just got a call about a vapor cloud. Why didn't you tell us about this? And the answer you might get is, well, we don't really have to, because
we waited 2 hours, it says we could wait 2 hours, and nothing really happened, there wasn't any fire, so I guess there couldn't have been a fire, or we would have had a fire, and so we're okay, right? And so the EC looks at the tools, and I have to say, yeah, I guess you're right, you didn't have to report it. So this encourages perpetual carelessness. This happens 1 week, okay? It happens again the next week, where you have a spill and a vapor cloud. There isn't any corrective action taken because you didn't even tell anybody about it. And then one day your light comes out and that vapor cloud ignites and people get hurt. This is a problem. So also I'll point out that again, fire potential off-site impacts. Well, what if you have an on-site impact? What if somebody dies? What if somebody at these facilities actually gets killed? You don't have to report that either, I guess, because it was on-site. And what about spills that cause methane release? Because a lot of times it doesn't ignite, but this happens. So you have a vapor cloud, it can cause asphyxiation. It certainly is contributing to climate change by putting methane up into the air in large volumes. That doesn't have to be reported. So there's a big problem there. I would say that if these rules are promulgated, you need to have a robust set of protocols to deal with all these things. And LNG spills, no matter how big or small they are, they need to be reported, and they need to be reported promptly. I would think that's common sense. Let me say something about financial security. This is what the rules say about financial assurance. Financial assurance may be required by the department to ensure the proper closure of facilities. The form and amount of such financial assurance, if any, will be established by the department. That doesn't sound very committal, does it? May be required, if any, the department will decide. For rules to mean anything, they need to say clearly what is required, not what might be required. Otherwise, there's no guarantee that the public will not eventually have to foot the bill for closing these facilities that the LNG operators are walking away from. That same issue, by the way, came up with the fracking regulations. And I'll point out, this relates to the closure of facilities. What about other things? What about the normal operation? Well, there is a statement in the rules that require that the applicant provide proof of liability insurance for proposed LNG operations, but it doesn't spell out what operations are. What's an operation? I guess the operator gets to decide. It needs to spell out that all accidents are going to be covered. Environmental damages or harm to impacted communities or individuals. That's what the liability insurance needs to cover, but that's not spelled out in the rules. Operator competency, you think that's something that would be required? It's not even mentioned. What you should be seeing is some type of expectation by the Department of Conservation that operators are going to be able to run their facilities safely. And when you determine that is by looking at past projects, you look at safety records or accident reports. There's no requirement that the applicant for a facility provide this information to do the same. And honestly, that kind of information should be provided periodically. It's not just a one-time thing. You need to be maintaining a proof of competency. None of this is addressed. I want to say something about the program fees. In its regulatory impact statement, DEC will tell you that it can recoup all the costs of administering regulations for LNG through the program fees that is put forward, and this is what those program fees are. I want to point out something. There's a problem scale here. This goes up to $2,500 for 70,000 gallons worth of capacity or greater. Well, an LNG terminal, an LNG tank can be up to, it's typical 100,000 cubic meters of storage. That's about 26 million gallons. That's a tank that's 26 million gallons in size. I don't know if this table came from something 30 years ago or how they came up with this, but clearly they weren't thinking about all the different type of facilities that could eventually be built and the size of tanks that we're talking about here. It's a problem of scale. DEC is creating a fee structure for that.
Okay. The small refueling stations would be smaller tanks.
However, they could be permitting this stuff. So there's a problem. The fees that would be collected every 5 years for facilities of any kind with a capacity greater than 70,000 gallons is only $2,500. I'm not sure that's actually adequate to even cover a 7,000 gallon tank and truly overseeing the operations of a facility the way it should be done. But it's certainly not adequate to deal with big stuff. So DEC should establish a fee structure capable of supporting any LNG project that could be approved. And I would, again, say that if DEC is saying, which it is saying, that this is all about truck refueling stations, then let's limit the size of these facilities to truck refueling stations and not something bigger. And that number should be 40,000 gallons. Inefficient emergency preparedness. This is the last one that I want to talk about. This ought to be really important, right? At an LNG plant where explosions can occur or fire can occur. The rules right now do require that a report be prepared on the preparedness of fire departments to respond to spills or fire. And it also requires that costs be estimated of what it would take to bring any inadequacies up to par for preparedness. But there's no real criteria in the rules for DEC to look at to see whether that's been met. And there's no requirement for those deficiencies, if they're identified, to be addressed before a permit is granted or before operations can commence. And another problem I see is that it only really talks about fire department capabilities. What about other emergency responders? What about paramedics? What about the capacity of hospitals in the area? What about law enforcement? When serious accidents happen, all these emergency responders come to play. It's all important. And the rules require that permit applicants offer an emergency response training program, but it doesn't say how comprehensive that training program has to be. It doesn't say that participation is mandatory. And it doesn't require that the responders demonstrate that they've learned something if they attend the class. There's no testing required. So anyway, if promulgated, the rules need to require a full assessment of preparedness for all the type of emergency services. And mandatory training and testing want to be part of the equation too. I want to end with this because I just saw this a day ago. This is the state environmental quality review form that was filled out by DEC when they determined that it was appropriate to go forward with these rules right now. They had to answer specific questions, and this is just an exact copy. This is a copy of that form, so you may not be able to read from where you are. But basically, it's asking specific questions about what the potential impacts could be, and it says, are there any air quality impacts, groundwater, noise, traffic, any problems there? How about aesthetics, historic, agricultural, other natural cultural resources, any impacts there? No. Vegetation, threat or endangered species, any impacts of proposing these rules, any impacts of these big industrial facilities coming in across the state? No. Every single question that was posed in the SECRA short form that was submitted, a perfunctory no without explanation was given. DEC is not acknowledging that there are any impacts of what they're proposing here by lifting the ban that we've had for 40 years on LNG facilities. To me, this is just striking. To me, this is just very disturbing. So what can we do about it? And this is where I hand it over to Sandra, who has done an amazing job with the 30 days of fracking regs relating to the power. I do want to reiterate what she also said, which is that we need to have people coming on October 30th to Albany. We really do. We've only been afforded one opportunity to testify on this. The public hearing is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the DEC offices in Albany. I know other things are happening that day, but I'll tell you that this is important. This is something where decisions will be made. So I encourage you to come to Albany and join us for that. Tell DEC what you think about this.